This brings me to an important humanities concept, so take notes, and that is don't confuse the narrator with the author. Let me say that again. In a fictional story, if you have a narrator, or even if it's third person, like O'Connor's story, we don't want to confuse the narrator with the writer. Sometimes they are very separate. Sometimes a writer will write stuff from a perspective they disagree with or that's totally foreign to them. So it's simplistic to say that the narrator equals the writer. That's a trap some people fall into, and while it can be true sometimes, it's not necessarily true. So, when I read Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart, I don't think that Poe actually killed someone and buried them under the floorboards. So it would be a mistake to say that everything in the story reflects Poe's thinking. That's just a common error in interpretation of humanity, so I wanted to make you aware of it. And speaking of not confusing the narrator with the writer or the artist, that leads me to a way in which I subconsciously acted according to things that were implanted in me by culture and family when I was younger. So I want to give you an example of this thing I talk about a lot, which is that we can have cues in our brain, things in our brain, assumptions, biases, that kind of thing, good and bad, that we don't remember learning. Just like we don't remember learning how to feed when we're a baby. That's too far back in your memory. It's just the way the brain works. So I want to talk about an example of me doing that to illustrate how you can be biased without intending to be. Now, when I was younger, I was resistant to rap as a genre of music. Now, no one has to like or dislike rap, just like any genre of music. But my point is, my reasons that I believed for not liking it they illustrate what I'm talking about pretty well. I thought I was offended by the violence in rap. They're talking about killing and all this stuff, violence. And I thought that I was also offended by the sampling that rap use, where they use other music parts or entire songs. And so I thought, well, those things, that's not real music. And blah, blah, blah. Now, let me be clear. I have been anti-racist for a long time. For my whole life, I've always had a passion for human rights. I make no apology about that. I don't even consider it liberal, even though I am pretty left. I think it's a pretty conservative value to be concerned about human rights because it's in the Constitution and the Bible, which are allegedly the founding documents of this country. So how can you be more conservative than that, right? So I've always thought that human rights were important and was repelled by racism and hated it consciously. But here's the thing. These things were programmed into me. And I'll tell you how I know. Well, number one, there's plenty of country and rock songs that are violent. But I listened to those, and I didn't think twice about it. Johnny Cash has a song called Delia, where he's in prison. The narrator is in prison, and he's talking about having killed his wife, and now he's being haunted by her ghost. He even sings another song about, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, which is pretty hardcore, right? And there's tons of songs about murder and violence in country and rock. But for some reason, they didn't bother me the way rap did when I heard about the violence in rap songs. You see, that was a double standard. It was an incongruity. I was allowing the violence in certain music, but not others. I wasn't offended by the violence in some music, but I was in this genre. I didn't see that for the double standard it was. It took a while for me to see that. And then when it comes to sampling, I mean, my goodness, songs have been sampling from each other and using riffs and whole sections or whole songs since music has been around. It's just a common practice. We just borrow from each other's. That's what music does. All genres of music. There's no 100% completely original genre of music. Sampling is common. Inspiration of other stuff is copying is common. It's all very common. But in my mind, it was like, rap music isn't even original. It doesn't even use its own music. And I'm happy to say that I was eventually able to see these double standards for what they were. And when I was honest with myself, I was like, the society I grew up in, and I hate to say it, but the family I grew up in and the environments I grew up in and the media and all this stuff had given me these ideas, which in my mind, since I'm not an evil racist, and I wasn't even then, I don't like racism. So I thought it couldn't possibly be because of race. I never even considered it. It took a while for me to even consider the idea that maybe maybe there were some racist cues buried in me, a non-evil, non-racist person, and yet I was behaving according to these double standards. Now, the point isn't here that you should like rap. Your mileage may vary. That's all subjective and taste driven, etc. But what I wanted to point out was my reasons at the time for not liking rap. And once I opened my mind, I do like rap, it turns out, quite a bit. So you can see that once the realization hit me, I could change my behavior, at least work on it. And that's one of the things we're talking about doing in this class. Okay, let's talk about the subject and object stuff that's discussed in the story. I'll give you a quote. This is from Hooks' story. By the way, Hooks wasn't her real name, but she took her grandmother's name to honor her grandmother, and she didn't capitalize it because she wanted the focus to be on the writing and not her as the writer. But the irony is, irony alert, the irony is that because she didn't capitalize it, it draws a lot of attention, and people do pay attention to her as writer, and like, why didn't she capitalize her name? So it didn't quite accomplish what she wanted to. That happens sometimes. So here's a quote from her story, from Hooks' story, Killing Rage. She says, "In the graduate seminar I teach on Toni Morrison, we pondered whether black folks and white folks can ever be subjects together if white people remain unable to hear black rage. If it is the sound of that rage which must always remain repressed, contained, trapped in the realm of the unspeakable." Did you ever know a person who thinks that what they are doing and going through is important and everyone else are just players in their story? You've known someone like that, right? Now that is just the egotistical version. That's the egoist version of the subject-object stuff that Hooks is referencing here. The idea of the subject and the object shapes our view of the world in subtle ways we might not be aware of consciously. There was this guy named Joseph Campbell who wrote this stuff called The Hero's Journey. You could look it up, where he looks at all these recurring myths that happen, mythological stories and characters that have happened in human stories over time. That in many, many stories throughout history, what we have is a hero who is on a journey. And this hero's like, I'm on a journey. Along the journey, Campbell points out, they meet people that affect their journey in some way. And a lot of times they meet a female character who's this wise oracle of a character who transforms how they think about life. And I owe her a lot because she was a stop on my journey that was awesome and helped me get to the next level, right? And so the problem with that is, as my daughter pointed out to me once, like, but wait, I'm on my own damn journey. And her point was, she's not a stop on someone else's journey. She also is on a hero's journey. So to relegate her, to limit her, is what relegate means, to limit her. But look at what's actually happening here. Here's the subject on the journey, and she is the object, something that affects the subject, the journeyer, some way. So yeah, it seems like she's valuable in the story, but really it's a way of devaluing her because she's just a stop on the hero's journey. Now, all of that to say, this is what that subject-object thing, that's what Hooks is talking about. And this comes up a lot when people study racism and other bigotry, sexism. It's the idea that sometimes, like, often put ourselves in the subject position and the other, meaning someone who's not like us, the other is the object, and I am to consider them, and they are a stop on my journey. And then it gets into stuff like control, like I can control you because you're just an object. And a lot of people, when they're writing about racism and bigotry, they argue for the fact that people need to be on an equal level as subjects. That's the only way for there to be true equality that goes down into the psyche, is to realize that those others are just as much a subject in the story as I am. Think about that quote about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Supreme Court saying people are like, when will you be happy with the number of women on the Supreme Court? She says, when there are 9. And that shocks people. And I would argue that she's doing that on purpose to make you see. I don't know that she actually believed that there should be one type of person on the Supreme Court. I don't think that was her point. I think her point was to shock you into seeing that, men have been on the Supreme Court, the 9 justices, white men at that, for much of the history of the Supreme Court. But what she was saying is we don't really see it when it's all just white men on the Supreme Court because that's considered the norm. They are the subject.